In 1571, Oda Nobunaga made a brutal choice, one that would carve his determination into history. He showed that there was no one and nothing that would stand in the way of his ambition, not even a holy temple. Mount Hiei towers over Kyoto, a forested mountain just northeast of the ancient capital. For centuries, it wasn't just a natural landmark, it was sacred ground. Atop it sat Enryaku-ji, the head temple of the powerful Tendai sect of Buddhism, founded in 788 by the monk Saicho. Enryaku-ji wasn't just a religious site, it was one of the most influential institutions in medieval Japan. By the 15th century, Enryaku-ji had grown into something far beyond a temple. It was a city of monks. Hundreds of buildings spread across the mountain, housing thousands of practitioners. Some devoted their lives to study and ritual. Others were trained in combat. Enryaku-ji was also a landowner. Its estates stretched across provinces. It collected taxes. It judged disputes. It even maintained its own military force, thousands of sohei or warrior monks, and it was politically active. The temple negotiated directly with emperors and shoguns. When threatened, it dispatched armed monks into Kyoto or used religious processions or religious demonstrations as political weapons. A mikoshi, which is a portable shrine, was often carried into the capital. And this was not just a spiritual act, it was used as a warning. Temples like Enryaku-ji operated almost like autonomous kingdoms at this point. They wielded religious, economic, and military power. But Enryaku-ji in particular was special. It was symbolic. It represented centuries of Buddhist authority and stood as a guardian of Kyoto. Yet by the late 1500s, Japan was changing. The age of warlords had begun. Power was no longer rooted in tradition, but in sheer force. And Enryaku-ji's insistence on independence was starting to look a lot like defiance. To the warlords fighting to unify the country, especially the one by the name Oda Nobunaga, Enryaku-ji wasn't just a holy site, it was a threat. By the mid-16th century, Japan was fractured. The central government had collapsed. Dozens of daimyo or warlords controlled fragmented territories, locked in a brutal and continuous civil war. Out of this chaos rose a figure who would defy tradition, crush resistance, and begin the unification of Japan through sheer force of will. Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was born into a minor clan in Owari province. He was underestimated at first by many, as he dressed strangely, acted unpredictably, and showed little interest in formal court rituals. But beneath that eccentricity or eccentricity was something far more dangerous: clarity of purpose. You see, Nobunaga believed that the only path to national unity was absolute and complete control, and he pursued it with ruthless efficiency. He revolutionized warfare with firearms and very flexible tactics. He crushed rivals with speed and psychological shock. And he demanded one thing from all who stood in his way: loyalty. But in that regard, there were institutions that refused to take the knee. Powerful Buddhist sects such as the Ikkoiki resisted him in the countryside. And above Kyoto, Enryaku-ji remained defiant, independent, armed, and allied with his enemies. To Nobunaga, Enryaku-ji wasn't just a religious order, it was a militarized obstacle, one that could threaten his hold on Kyoto and undermine his legitimacy. It had to be dealt with. But this wasn't a decision made lightly. Even for a man like Nobunaga, attacking a sacred mountain carried enormous risk. It would mean violating centuries of religious sanctity. It would mean burning a symbol of Japan's spiritual heart, and it would mean killing monks, not warriors. Still, to Nobunaga, the cost of inaction was far greater than the cost of blood, so the stage was set for one of the most shocking acts of the Sengoku period, a military campaign not against some castle, but a temple. Tension between Oda Nobunaga and Enryaku-ji had been simmering for years. The monks of Mount Hiei had a long history of playing politics. But in the late 1560s, their neutrality had vanished. They began to actively support Nobunaga's enemies, openly. Now, some sources suggest that Enryaku-ji gave refuge to members of the rival Asakura clan, one of the greatest threats to Nobunaga's early power base. Others claim that the monks provided troops and supplies to anti-Oda factions forming in Kyoto and in the surrounding provinces. And when Nobunaga moved his forces through the capital, Enryaku-ji reportedly refused him passage, even as his enemies were moving freely on their mountain. So to Nobunaga, this wasn't just disrespect, it was treason. But what really sealed Enryaku-ji's fate wasn't just strategy, it was symbolism. The mountain had long been seen as a protector of the capital, a spiritual shield standing to the northeast of Kyoto, the direction from which evil was believed to flow. To burn it would be unthinkable, but to let it stand, Nobunaga believed, was to leave a dagger at his very back. And therefore, in the summer of 1571, Nobunaga issued a warning. He demanded that Enryaku-ji disavow his enemies and cease their political interference. The temple refused, and with that, the decision was made. What came next would shock even the hardened warriors of the Sengoku period. A military assault on a sacred ground with the express purpose of leaving nothing behind. Nobunaga would not negotiate. He would not spare the innocent. He would erase Enryaku-ji, not just as a threat, but as an example for others. The final provocation had come, and now came the consequences. In the early morning of September 29th, 1571, the slopes of Mount Hiei trembled. Oda Nobunaga had arrived with thousands of soldiers, fully armed and under strict orders. Destroy everything. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a systematic purge. Nobunaga's forces ascended the mountain from multiple directions. They burned temples, halls, libraries, everything they got in contact with. They cut down the monks who tried to flee and those who didn't. Contemporary accounts vary, but many suggest that thousands were killed. And not only monks, but also women and children. Jesuit missionaries later wrote of the attack in horror, describing how the mountain, the whole mountain, was enveloped in flames. The libraries of Enryaku-ji, home to rare scrolls, centuries of scholarship, and sacred relics, were all reduced to ash. Structures that had stood for generations were all erased over the course of a single day. There are few detailed military records of the siege, and that in and of itself says something. And this was not a campaign to be glorified, it was a campaign meant to be remembered through fear. For Nobunaga, this was more than a military operation, it was psychological warfare. A message not only to Kyoto, but to all of Japan. No institution, no matter how sacred, would stand in his way. When the fires on Mount Hiei died down, nothing remained. Enryaku-ji, once the most powerful temple in Japan, was gone. Its buildings leveled, its monks slaughtered, its influence reduced to but ashes and memories. The destruction sent shockwaves through the country. Some daimyo whispered in fear. Others took the lesson to heart. Oppose Oda Nobunaga, and there would be no sanctuary anywhere, not even in the god's own house. But for the people of Kyoto and for Japanese Buddhism, the massacre had profound consequences. The Tendai sect never regained its former independence. Its military power was utterly broken and its political influence irreparably weakened. Other militant religious groups like the Ikuiki would resist Nobunaga in the years that followed. But after Mount Hiei, no one doubted what he was willing to do. For Nobunaga himself, the destruction of Enryaku-ji became both infamous and iconic. To some, he was a visionary, tearing down the old to build a new, unified Japan. To others, he was a heretic, a warlord who had burned the sacred along with centuries of tradition. Now, Enryaku-ji was eventually rebuilt decades later. Today, visitors walk through its halls, admire its serene gardens, and pray in its temples. But many don't know that beneath their feet lie the ruins of fire and the remnants of one of the darkest days in Kyoto's history. The massacre of Enryaku-ji marked the end of an era, one where religion had once ruled politics and monks had once ruled the mountains. That world was over. And if you enjoyed this video, to watch more dark history videos about Japan, you can check out this video next. See ya.